And we won't come back until we've kissed a girl. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Human Geography. Here we are today going to talk about the history of nation states. Nation states is something I already talked about in the first 2 weeks of my class, but it's all coming back again. So I'm going to kind of review that concept and then also dive a whole lot deeper into it because this stuff's really important for the political unit, which will be on the AP test. So let's check it out. All right, first thing you got to know are all the political entities. All these 6 words right here are the political entities, so I'm just going to cover all these to you guys. You should have all remembered the first 3 words. I covered these in class. If we were in class right now, we'd have a big kind of discussion about what these words are, but I'll just tell you them all because it's just me. So, a nation. Nations are groups of people who share either a religion, a language, a common historical background. It's sort of almost the same thing as an ethnic group, but examples of nations in the world today are the Irish, the Japanese, the Kurds, the Uyghurs. You could even argue the Amish are a nation. The Dene are definitely a nation. So nations are groups of people. States is synonymous with the word country. Now, the state of Nevada is a state within the United States, but the United States as a whole is one state. We are one country that just also uses the word state to chop us up into smaller pieces. So in the world today, I think there's about 210 states because there's about 210 countries. So that's what you got to know. And then we get to the term nation states. Nation states is when one group of people sort of correspond with one country. And the way that I would define it is if a country has 90% the same ethnic group, that country is a nation state. I think there's probably only about a dozen clear examples of nation states in the world today. But so these are countries that are almost everybody in that country is the same ethnic group. We're talking about Japan, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Iran. I'm going to argue Israel is a nation state because it's kind of the land for the Jews. So if there is one country that has one group, they are a nation state. All right, and then the opposite of that is stateless nations. These are groups of people that do not have a country to call their own. The biggest example of these people in the world is the Kurds. The Kurds would just love to have their own country in the Middle East, but they don't have one, and it kind of sucks for them. I taught you guys some other examples of stateless nations before, too, in the culture unit. We talked about the Uyghurs in China. They don't have their own country. The Boers in South Africa don't have their own country. The Quebecois in Canada don't have their own country. The Dene don't have their own country. So they are all stateless nations. And they would love their own country. It would be great. All right, then multinational states. States that have a whole bunch of different ethnic groups living in them. And these are just about all the larger countries in the world. Of course, the United States, we've got every nation in the world represented here practically. So we are absolutely a nation state. Or a multinational state. We are not a nation state. I take that back. The United States is a multinational state. China is a multinational state. The United Kingdom is 4 different nation states that kind of all came together. You know, they've Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland. So they are 4 groups coming together, multinational state. Russia is a great example. India is a great example. So bigger countries tend to be that. And then multi-state nations. This one's a little more tricky. This is when there's a group of people who sort of all share the same cultural concepts, but they're spread out over multiple countries. I will argue that you'll really only see this in 2 parts of the world, in Latin America and in the Arab world. Because in the Arab world, Egyptians are pretty much all Muslim. They all speak Arabic. And then in Saudi Arabia, they're pretty much all Muslims. They all speak Arabic. So the idea is there could be one super Arab country that is just the whole Muslim world united together. That's never happened. They're all cut up into these different these different states. So that's why the Arab world is a multi-state nation, because there's sort of this universal Arab identity. And I'll argue it's almost the same thing in Latin America. Just about everybody in Latin America speaks Spanish. Sorry, Brazil. They all are Roman Catholic Christians. They kind of have this shared cultural tradition of being under the Spanish occupation for 500 years, but they are not one united country. They are many different countries, which is why Latin America is also a multi-state nation. All right, cool. So that's all those concepts. Okay. I do have a quizzes connecting to all these topics. I would have played it in class if we were there. So if any of my students want to play this quiz, reach out to me and I'll make it happen somehow. So this will be something we can definitely do in review for the test. See how you know all that stuff. Okay, now let's talk about semi-autonomous regions. If you are one of those multi-nation states, a lot of times there's going to be some ethnic conflicts within your country. So what these larger countries tended to do was to kind of make different laws and rules in different parts of their country, sort of to more reflect the cultural differences that will be found around their giant country. The examples I'll present to you guys are China, the United States, and on the next slide, Australia. I know Russia is also another good example of this, and also India is a good example of this. But there's so many different peoples, and they kind of want to have their own different rules and maybe their own different laws. And so the federal governments of these bigger countries, they kind of give some exceptions to the rule on certain parts of the country. I'll even argue that Nevada is, in a way, a semi-autonomous region of the United States because, well, our state government has made gambling illegal and prostitution illegal. So that's not true with any other parts of the country, and that's kind of cool about Nevada. But we're not a great example, though, for an F or Q. Semi-autonomous regions, these places are almost disconnected from the whole rest of the country. I mean, it's not saying like they're independent. I mean, they can't really make their own money or do any foreign policies. But the country does give them a whole lot of leeway. The Chinese ones are really well known. We're talking about Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Hong Kong, and Macau. Hong Kong and Macau, the rules are way different than the rest of China. And actually, recently, there's been that whole crackdown in Hong Kong because Hong Kong people want to have even more freedom and independence from the rest of China. And then you guys probably don't know, but here in the United States, the federal government actually doesn't have authority over pretty big parts of the United States, all these Native American reservations, especially this big one down here. This is the Navajo Dine Reservation. And yeah, if you commit a crime in those parts of the United States, you will be prosecuted under tribal law, not federal law, which is just kind of interesting. It shows you that even parts of our own country aren't fully united. And Australia is basically copying us. They also have indigenous areas where there are these native peoples who've lived in Australia way longer than white people have, and they kind of have their own laws and rules on the lands they can call their own. So, if you need more time to write this down, stop the video here, but I'm bouncing through it. So here we go. China's autonomous regions, Xinjiang, Tibet. Man, both these parts of China are not getting a lot of love from Beijing right now. And then Hong Kong, Macau, way down here by Guangzhou. Those also used to be colonies by Britain and Portugal, respectively. So they kind of have their own special rules. And then here in the United States, yep, this big reservation right here is the Dine Navajo Reservation. I used to work, actually, on one of these tiny reservations by San Diego, the Barona Reservation. Oh, that was a tough job. And I also know that the poorest part of the United States is way up here in South Dakota. I think it's on the Sioux Reservation, a place called Pine Ridge. Man, it's really poor there. And just about everybody who lives there is a Native American, and they need some help. And the federal government tries, but I don't know if there's a lot of motivation to really make things better up there. Okay, and then here's some pictures of Australia's vibe. So, I remember that people got confused when I showed pictures of Aboriginal Australians. They're like, Mr. Brown, are they Africans? I was like, well, no, like, they're Australians. They're the original Australians. It's just white people moved in, and they sort of had the same experience of Native Americans in our country, where they got persecuted and pushed away, and there were some wars, and they always lost. And I know some really depressing stuff in Australia's history. the Aboriginal people got forced to live in the central part of the outback, which is not a really great place to live your lives. And the Australian government forcibly took all the children away from these Aboriginal people, turned them into Christians, taught them English education, and sort of tried to convert the cultures of these native peoples. Thankfully, it didn't work 100%, and the Aboriginal people of Australia still have and practice their culture, but there's definitely a lot of historical bad blood between the Aboriginal people and the Australian government. All right, so now let me go through kind of the history of nation states. Believe it or not, countries, as we know them today, is relatively a new concept over human history. So much of human history was a ruler in Rome or London kind of looked at a map and said, all right, this is my land and this is your land. And they didn't really take into account the human geography. Like sometimes they took into account the rivers and the mountains and the oceans. So they did draw maps dependent on the world geography. But what I really want to focus on here is that so much time over history, they didn't really care about the languages the peoples of that part of the world spoke or the religions. They just, everything was just, the map was a blank map to them. And learning about the people living there didn't really matter. So that's what I'm really going to try to vibe with y'all. Just showing you how different European maps were in the past. You can see that, Spain and Portugal are kind of the same as they were today. France is kind of the same as today. England's kind of the same. But wow, Germany, Italy, and then all this, none of this is recognizable in a world map today. So showing you that cultures and the human people who lived there weren't really being respected. Here's another map. It kind of shows you how wild European borders used to change. And then maybe this is a little more recognizable, but still nothing like the map we know today of Europe. These maps were redrawn so much because of wars and conflict. Europe used to be a really violent place. Interesting fact, the last, since the end of World War II, so this is 80 years, has been the most peaceful period of European history in all of world history, which is shocking. Anyway, this period of wildly changing borders finally started to settle during the Renaissance, which is about 520 years ago. And once we had the Renaissance, things started to look a little bit more like the map we kind of know and love of Europe today. So here's the Roman Empire. You can see they're kind of growing into the Middle East and Egypt there. And then, Germany is a mess right here. And then, oh look, Prussia, Jaden's favorite country. Germany still, I don't even know what the heck's happening there. Italy, also a mess. But England kind of looks the same. France is pretty set. Spain, Portugal, they're pretty set. Denmark and Norway, they used to be one country. Kind of cool. So let me keep going through history here. So how do countries expand and grow? Well, for most of history, what happened was when a country kind of, I don't want to say ran out of space, but when a country felt they had some excess people who maybe wanted greater opportunities or greater freedoms, a country could sort of allow their people to colonize lands farther away from the mother country. Typically, these colonists were still administered from their home country, and it was just sort of like your country was growing its borders, growing its influence, growing its culture all over the dang planet. And most European civilizations actually got started from Greek colonists. That's why so many European languages are based on Greek, because Greeks first got somewhere and then they got isolated and their language split and spread, and that made most of the European languages we know today. Some other examples of colonists were, of course, the Mayflower, the ship that brought the Pilgrims to the United States. We were colonists originally from England, and we at first were administered directly from London, but then we had a revolution, made our own country. You know the story. Another example of colonists were the conquistadors. And there is kind of a historical debate were the conquistadors colonists or imperialists, but the conquistadors came in there and they made relationships with native women, and from there they built sort of a society and a culture that was still sort of administered from Spain. And the way you can really know if it's a colony is if your civilians are moving to other parts of the world and kind of setting up new cities, new culture stuff, and they're still kind of having a relationship with the mother country. So let's check it out. Colonies. Here's, I think this is Christopher Columbus claiming Hispaniola for Spain. One of the first things he did was he built Santo Domingo. Was the city called that? I think it was called that at the time. And, he built a city and encouraged people from Spain to come there, and they made it kind of an extension of Spain. Here's the Greeks spreading their love all over the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Here's the Mayflower coming over. Oh, look, it's Thanksgiving. Just all these British civilians giving some food to the Indians. Oh, man, it eventually got really, really bad for them. Okay, so around the 1800s, Europeans were far more technologically advanced than just about every other country in the world. Europeans had fancy cannons, fancy iron ships, they had machine guns, and all these other cultures in Africa and Asia, they were still in like medieval times with bows and arrows and lances and swords. So Europeans kind of got together and they said, hey, there's no more quote-quote empty land around the world. There's no more of this terra nullius where we can found new cities and bring in our civilians. What we should do now is rather than bring our civilians to set up new spots around the world, we should send in our militaries and we should, at gunpoint, force these people who are less developed than us to kind of follow our rules, give us their money, do whatever we want. That's really what happened, especially in the later half of the 1800s. Europeans took over the whole dang world, especially in Africa and Asia. I think almost every inch of Africa was owned by a European country at some point. And the legacy of that is so many African countries speak European languages today, because they were kind of forced to at gunpoint. So you really do got to know from me the difference between colonialism and imperialism. And colonialism happened first. It was all about bringing civilians, creating new cities under this claim that America and Australia were empty land without people. They were unowned land. But imperialism was when we knew other countries owned the land. Rather than bring in our civilians, we just brought in our military and said, hey, you're going to work for us now, which is really messed up. This is definitely a dark period in history. So let's check it out. All right, here's the Dutch settlers. These are the Boer people. They were definitely colonists more than imperialists, but we could have a whole debate on that. Anyway, they came to South Africa. Their excuse was no one was there, so we started our culture, made some cities. But as you can see in this original picture, there were African people in South Africa. South Africa is some really great farmland, so it's some serious culture difficulties in South Africa. All right, and here we got the German guys grabbing some land in Africa, the Russian guy grabbing some land in Asia, and it's these European powers just focusing their efforts on taking over the world. Here's a Chinaman really upset that all these Europeans, oh look, and Japan was a military power too, are taking over his country. And then, the excuse was Australia was terra nullius, and we know Aboriginal people lived in Australia. But I mean, I'll agree, though, that Australia is a big old continent that wasn't fully populated. So Europeans might have some case that there were open, unclaimed land that they took over, and later in history they had wars with the Aboriginal people. Terra nullius, the journey to no one's land. Celebrate Columbus Day by walking into someone's house and telling them we live there now. Yeah, that's some serious stuff. And then humans, Captain Arthur. Correct me, lad. What you see afore is a wild herd of black savages. So they're saying that they're not even real people, which was the excuse Europeans used to take over the world. So that's racist and rude. And then, this also kind of shows the racism of this time of colonialism and imperialism, where Europeans really did feel for all the way up and probably until 1950 that they were this kind of master race over all these other peoples in the world. Okay, so yeah, and I think I covered a little bit of this. In 1900, 95% of Africa and Asia were controlled by white people. That 5% that wasn't was basically Ethiopia, Liberia, and Japan. Pretty much everything else was owned by Europeans. And then there is a event in history that you definitely must know for this class. The event was called the Conference of Berlin. This happened in 1885, and it was when the Prime Minister of Prussia, high five to Jaden, the Prime Minister of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, he called together just about every European king and queen to his place in, I think it happened in Paris, actually. And he called them all together, and he said, hey guys, let's look at a map of Africa, and let's just decide who gets what. And these European countries really didn't, they first of all didn't invite anyone from Africa to the conference. Nobody, I think there might have been a couple explorers, but there really wasn't anybody who was a expert on African cultures or African history. They did consider a little bit of Africa's physical geography, but at the Conference of Berlin, they had no idea what the peoples of Africa, what languages they spoke, what religions they had, what were the tribal lines. Africa is a wildly diverse country or continent ethnically, and when Europeans cut up Africa, they didn't consider any of the human geography at all. So they based these imperial borders on latitude and longitude lines. And the kind of the sad thing is these borders were in place in Africa for the next 80 years. And what happened as a result of this was villages were cut in half, cultural groups were forced to be in the same countries together, and it's left this legacy of a human mess in Africa that really was directly caused by Europeans. So let's check out some of these pictures here. Here's Otto von Bismarck cutting up an Africa cake just like they did with China. And then all these European countries want a little piece of Africa. Here they are at the Conference of Berlin, shaking hands. All these European countries deciding how Africa is going to get split up. And so before the Conference of Berlin, these were some pretty established African nations and I would even argue states. They obviously weren't states respected by Europeans, however. But once the Conference of Berlin happened, France took over all this spot in the north. So as you can see, they kind of combined all these different groups into being one super group. England took over so much of this. England's here in the pink. They also got, this will become Nigeria. And as you see, Nigeria has like 5 different groups in it. So they're not all going to get along. Belgium took over the Congo. They did a lot of really messed up stuff there. So Africa did get taken over, and it has a huge legacy today. Here's some pictures of what happened in the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo was probably one of the worst human disasters in world history, and it's not commented on a lot. The King of Belgium ordered every single Congolese man to harvest a quota of rubber every month, and if the man didn't harvest enough rubber, King Leopold's agents would cut off a child's hand. So it got really, really bad in the Congo. And that happened for something like 30 years. More people died in the Belgian Congo than died in the Holocaust. So that's some scary stuff. And then this picture kind of shows you what this whole period was about. The West kind of just harvested all these materials out of Africa in the age of imperialism. It was all about, harvesting that rubber, that gold, those diamonds. It really wasn't about improving Africa to any degree. So when we ask the question, why is Africa suffering in so many ways today, it largely is because of this historical legacy. And then here's Cecil B. Rhodes striding across all of the continent of Africa. He was a guy who lived about 150 years ago. Cecil B. Rhodes said, "I own Africa," which is kind of scary. All right, so now let's start connecting it more to the modern day. In the aftermath of World War II, let me explain it like this. During World War II, the Japanese and the Nazis, the quote-quote bad guys, talked a whole lot of crap about Britain and France, saying, hey, you two are the real bad guys because you have all these imperial possessions all over the world. You're basically enslaving the peoples of Asia and Africa. You need to let those peoples go. And Britain and Africa, it was really tough for them to get, Britain and France, it was really tough for them to get the peoples of their imperial possessions to work for them in World War II. Famously, Mahatma Gandhi, who was sort of, under control of the British at that time, he sent letters to Adolf Hitler, and he said, hey, Hitler, if tanks ever come to India, I will welcome them with open arms and see you as my liberator. And that really freaked out the British. So what they said was, hey, guys, you help us beat the Nazis and the Japanese. We'll let you all go independent. And thankfully, those deals were largely met. There were some places that wasn't so easy transition, but once World War II did end, so many imperial countries finally got free. And that only happened about 60 years ago. So this is all pretty recent history here. And let me phrase it like this. Whenever a country gives up political power over even a part of their country, it's called devolution. Hold on. Sneezing. Okay, anyway, devolution. That's when you could be giving up a colony and making it independent. You could be saying, hey, at the federal level, we said prostitution is illegal, but now we'll give you the option to keep prostitution illegal, or you can make it, you can sort of mandate it with whatever laws you want at your local level. So here in the United States, there is actually quite a bit of devolution between the states. States had the ability to make marijuana illegal or illegal, and there's still some conflict at the national level about the legality of marijuana, but it's whenever the higher tier of government gives up some of their powers. And that absolutely happens with multi-nation states. All those semi-autonomous regions I talked about earlier, that's all a great example of devolution. Devolution and decolonization is kind of the same concept too. It's when you're just kind of, the government is saying, like, be free, we can tell that you're not having a good time with us, so do your own thing. And a lot of these ethnic groups in various countries around the world are advocating for devolution for themselves. Like the Quebecois, they want French to be the official language of their part of Canada. The rest of Canada is sort of like, well, okay, we'll make the whole country both English and French. So that's what devolution's all about. Devolution is especially happening in the United Kingdom. I know that the Scottish people are really pissed off at the English, so the government in London is now giving Scotland some more freedoms and some more of their own laws and options they can do in their part of the country. So there we go. Devolution. Let the other ethnic group make some of their own private decisions. Africa becomes free. This map here shows you when various parts of the world gained independence. And as you see, so many countries in the world got independent between 1950 and 1974. It's like all of Africa, so much of Asia. And this was more or less at the end of World War II, and they finally got free. So that's great. All these new countries popping up all over the world. And then, yep, this just shows you more about the exact dates, and it was just kind of all these colonies said, we won World War II, let us be free, prove that you're the good guys. So that's what's happened. Okay, so now you would hope that once all these African countries got free, they could revert their borders back to what they were before the Conference of Berlin. But there already was so much infrastructure planted around these European cities that the Europeans really built up. And the Europeans, they did teach their languages to big parts of Africa. And so quite a few African countries were created based on Europe's borders rather than their human geography borders, which has just led to a mess. Just a terrible mess. And I'm going to make the argument that Africa's borders need to be redrawn to better suit the human geography elements of Africa. because even right now, there's plenty of African countries that share multiple religions, multiple languages, multiple ethnic groups that have hated each other forever. A prime example of this is what happened in Rwanda in the 1990s. The Hutus and the Tutsis, they just were at each other because finally they got independent and they said, hey, now that the Europeans aren't watching us anymore, it's the best one survives. And they just totally went after each other, and millions of people died, and it's some scary, scary stuff. So so many countries in Africa are multi-nation states, and that is a problem because they don't have a history together of being a multi-nation state, and a lot of these tribes absolutely hate each other. And my sister, who's been working in Uganda, has told me a lot about her experience there, where if you are a part of the tribe of the president makes sure you get all the bonuses and all the economic benefits. But if you're not with the president's tribe, you're like treated like a second-class citizen, and it sparks civil wars and conflict, and it's a problem. So let's check this out. So here's kind of a map that shows you what human geographers have said is kind of a good way to divide the language, religion, cultural ties of Africa. It obviously is not the modern-day map of Africa today. Here's another map, shows you some of the historical countries that have existed in Africa. So Ethiopia, hey, you're still around. What up, my Bus Ma'am friends? And then, West Africa was all kinds of different countries. The Bantu states were spread around there. But these historical countries aren't really being respected today. Here's another map which kind of shows you all the different ethnic and language groups in Africa. And so, like the map of Africa today, I think Africa has about 40, 50 countries today. In a better world, Africa should be 150 countries. They really should cut up some of these bigger countries to more accurately reflect the cultures of Africa, because there's been so much conflict in this part of the world. And hopefully, as you guys know from all the statistics I've taught you in this course, Africa is the part of the world that really needs the most help. All right, so and that's exactly what I was just saying. You got to redraw Africa's borders, and perhaps the conflict could be a way more prosperous place and have far less conflict. So let me cover some of this stuff now too. There's so much violence, especially in Nigeria. The country of Nigeria is the most populated country in Africa. It's the 7th most populated country in the world. And the country is about half Muslim, half Christian, and they just hate each other. And it's really sad. You got to cut Nigeria in half. That would really help a lot. Liberia has a very interesting history. I recommend you guys look it up. But there were these former African-American slaves who moved to Liberia and then mistreated the native people of Liberia. And that history went on for a really long time, and it had this huge, crazy civil war in the later 1900s. And Sudan, the newest country in the world is South Sudan, and the South Sudanese are Christians and animists. The North Sudanese are Muslims. And these religious conflicts are just really wild. And I already mentioned Tutsi and Hutu. So conflict spots around Africa, as you see, all of these spots are where there's been some kind of violence or war in Africa recently. And it's basically the whole continent. And it's really sad. And I can confidently tell you that a lot of these conflicts are based on the fact that certain tribal groups feel that the government is neglecting them. And my sister can attest that there are times where these African governments truly are neglecting certain minority groups, and the minority groups respond with violence. And it's we should just make every nation in Africa a nation state. That would help so much. All right, and then this shows you conflict, violence, genocides in recent years. So there was the genocide in Yugoslavia, genocide in Iran, but then 2 genocides in Africa. A lot of serious wars happened in Africa. And it's Africa and the Middle East. That's where the real trouble spots are for violence in the world today. And then here's a whole nother thing I could even get into. Once Europeans left Africa and all this violence started, China has recently moved in and said, hey, China, we will help you out with our money, but you got to give us your natural resources. And so a lot of these African countries said, okay. And I think it's very fair to argue that's what's happening today is China's building infrastructure in Africa, and they're building fancy buildings usually for the fancy guys in government. And then these African leaders are saying, all right, China, you can have all of our gold, all of our diamonds. So China's getting a really good deal out of it. And in a lot of ways, it's just economic imperialism. China's not going in there with their military. China's going in there with money. And Africa's always giving China a very good deal. And yeah, this conflicts in Africa, these really got to come to an end. It'll make the world a far better place. All right, now let's talk about irredentalism. This is a pretty unique concept. This is when there are multiple peoples spread around the world in different countries or different parts of a country that would love to connect together and either join an existing country or make their own country. So, like, devolution was, we want less control from a government, we want to be more independent. Irredentalism is, we want to join up with somebody else. You know, we don't necessarily want to be independent. We want to join up with our neighbor, or we want to connect our ethnic group and then become our own thing. So let's talk about some parts of the world that have had irredentalism. Albania. So many Albanians live in Kosovo. I think the people of Kosovo made a resolution saying, hey, we should just join Albania because we all speak the same language, we're all the same people, we all want to kind of connect together. So that's the example of irredentalism. I should even have this on this slide, but irredentalism is the IRA. We want to connect our people from the southern half of Ireland to the northern half. Oh man, my accent sucks today. But yeah, the Irish people in Northern Ireland who are fighting with the IRA, they want to break away from the UK and join the rest of Ireland. So that's another great example. Here in the Palestinian-Arab conflict, you can see that the Palestinian people are separated geographically now between Gaza and the West Bank. And there has been this debate of saying, hey, we want to have at least a road connecting the West Bank and Gaza because we are sort of one cultural group and we feel like we're not being accessible to each other. But this is honestly the situation on the ground today. So even Israel is now cutting up parts of the West Bank and making it sort of like there's all these little islands of Palestinians, and it's becoming harder and harder for them to be one cohesive cultural group. This is the country of Yugoslavia. I'm pretty confident I can say this is the map of the Muslims of Yugoslavia. So when Yugoslavia fell apart in the 1990s, this whole country was just really confusing because so many parts of Yugoslavia said we want to be our own Christian countries. That was Kosovo, that was Serbia. But then Bosnia's like, well, we're going to be all Muslim. And what happened was this huge war broke out because, as you can see, the Muslims are majority in Bosnia, but then they're also all over the dang place in Croatia, Serbia, and Montenegro as well. So the human geography was very difficult when Yugoslavia broke up, and what happened was a whole lot of violence. And then, here's Spain. Parts of Spain are trying to have their own little breakups as well. These are the Catalonian people. They live mostly in the city of Barcelona. They speak their own language. They want to do their own thing. But the real example of irredentalism here is the Basque people. If you remember, most of the Basques are right here in northern Spain, but there also are some Basques in France. And I think the Basques would, first of all, love to connect their people between France and Spain. Second of all, they would love to be their own country. So they're kind of an example of devolution and of irredentalism because they are in two countries and they want to be their own thing. And here's a clean example of irredentalism. It's what's been happening in Ukraine recently. So percentage of the population that identified as Russian, the majority of people in the Crimean Peninsula and near the city of Donetsk, they speak Russian, read Russian newspapers, follow every Russian thing you could imagine. So what happened in the 2010s was these Russian people said, that, hey, we just want to break away from Ukraine and join up with Mother Russia. And in so many statistical ways, you can see that. It's that just this kind of southern, eastern half of Ukraine identify more as Russian than Ukrainian. So through irredentalism, these people split away from Ukraine, joined up with Russia, and I think Ukraine has basically given up the Crimean part of their country right now, but I think there still is some conflict and wars going on near Donetsk because there's people who want to join up with Russia and people want to stay with Ukraine. And then, yeah, here's the great Kurdish nation of old. The Kurdish people would love to all get together and create this dream country right here, but this country doesn't exist because the Kurdish people live in Turkey and Iran and Iraq and Syria, and it would be impossible to get them all together. So, sorry, Kurds, but it's not going to happen. Yeah, so anyway, I already talked about the Kurds, talked about the IRA. The Uyghurs, the Uyghurs in China, they also would love to have devolution. The Dine, I think the Dine would like to be their own country. They're not really economically super prosperous there. And, I actually dated a Dine girl one time. Oh, she was so cool. Well, first of all, it didn't work out. Second of all, though, she talked to me a lot about Dine culture and said, I was like, do you people want to be independent? And she's like, we just want the government to leave us alone. The Quebecois, as you know, they voted for independence several times, and it was really close. The Amish, I'm not sure if the Amish want to be their own country, but I think they're kind of like the Dine. They just want to be left alone. And Taiwan is, that's a whole story. So Taiwan, the United States recognizes it as a country, but China says it belongs to them. And for the last 80 years, China and Taiwan have been talking a lot of crap to each other. And so much crap that China used their influence and does not allow Taiwan to participate in the United Nations. China says, Taiwan, we own you, so we're going to make decisions for you. And Taiwan's really pissed, but no one's really coming to Taiwan's aid there. So there's some serious political stuff with Taiwan happening right now, too. All right, that's it for my presentation today. If anybody has any questions on the history of nation states and some of these words, feel free to email me and I'll get back to you. All right, peace out, kids.